Welcome to Casual Politics, Shirley Williams. Thank you very much for accepting my request for the second time, and I'm very grateful to you. Shirley Williams, it's in more than half a century that you're involved in politics. When was your finest hour in politics?
I suppose two, really. One was winning the 1975 referendum on the European Union, where we were not, it was very close, very close, but it wasn't. It was quite a substantial majority. So that was one, because we'd all put a lot of work into it. The second, I think, was not so much a particular moment. It was getting into the cabinet when I was about 35, I suppose, no, 40. And in particular, becoming Education Secretary, which I wanted to do because I was really keen on comprehensive schools.
And you actually, when you were Education Secretary, you continued Anthony Crosland's legacy, is that right?
I think it would be fair to say that. I mean, he didn't have much time to implement his policies.
It was
because
only for 2 years. It was.
And he was already, very busy with other things. But also, I think he didn't have as much to do with schools as I did, because he was really an academic of the university level. But I think it's fair to say it was a legacy. Perhaps the slight difference was that I was more caught up with two other kinds of equality than he was. One was equality of men and women, and in terms of the opportunities they were offered, and the other was the equality of people of different race. Again, in both cases, that the opportunities offered to them should be similar. In other words, that they wouldn't be excluded or cut down because they happen to be either female or black or whatever it might be. That there had to be a concept of equality across the whole range.
And what do you make of the government's new policy that approved for a new grammar school in Kent?
I don't approve of it at all. Kent has been never has ceased to be a selective county. It's not new in Kent. Kent has always had selection. It still has selection. The results aren't particularly outstanding. It's not as if you could turn around and say Kent is the most successful county in England. It's not true. So I don't believe that the fact that Kent has selection still makes a case at all for selection. But because it's always had selection, it's never stopped having selection, it's not as much of a revolution as people think. There have always been grammar schools in Kent. This is just another one.
But would there be more grammar schools across the country?
I think it's quite possible, especially now that the very close link between local authorities, what we would call county councils and so on, and schools have been effectively broken by the present, well, not just the present government, but by Conservative governments of some time past. Essentially, throughout the control and direction of local authorities, they're now a relatively weak element in the whole thing, which means that counties that are committed to comprehensive schooling, like Cambridgeshire or Bedfordshire or Northumberland or whatever, don't any longer have the same influence on the government in terms of saying, this is what we want to be. We want to be non-selective. So it may be that there will be a comeback of grammar schools, in which case I should be very sad, because one of the great things about the comprehensive school is that youngsters from every possible sort of background, if they apply themselves, if they work, if they think, will have the same opportunity to get, for example, to university as youngsters from a much more privileged background. You don't get that without comprehensive schools, because effectively your opportunities are cut off at about 13 or 14, when you don't take A-levels and you don't take all the rest of them, simply because often a modern school, the alternative to a grammar school, will not have a proper sixth form and not have proper teaching at the sixth form level. And
you mentioned Europe. About Europe, because one of the reasons that you split from Labour Party and you went on to join SDP was because
not to join, but to form.
Yeah, to form. You were one of the founders of the SDP with the so-called Gang of Four. And then the EU referendum in 1975, people, they voted to stay in. But 4 years later, when your party lost in an election to Lady Thatcher, the executive party decided to reconsider whether to stay or not. Was that
the Labour Party? The Labour Party had strongly supported staying in. Much more strongly than Mrs. Thatcher, actually. But as you rightly say, a couple of years down the line, when the great battle in the Labour Party was between left and right, John Silkin, who had never been in favour of the European Union, or the European communities it then was, moved a motion at the Labour Party conference of 1980 to say that the Labour Party should commit itself to getting out. I found that not only I didn't like the policy, but what I thought was shocking was it had only been a few years before that we'd had the national referendum which had decided to keep Britain in. And I thought, therefore, that this dismissive attitude towards the public opinion on an issue as big as Europe was not acceptable. And that was one of the main reasons why, in the end, the three of us, Rogers, Owen and I, decided that we were going to start another party with a commitment to Europe.
And what do you make of David Cameron's renegotiations with his counterpart? Do you think that he will fool the people like as did Harold Wilson in 1975? And there will be
I don't think that's quite fair. I think,
terms.
no, I don't accept the word fooled. I think that's not right. I think what actually happened in the case of Harold Wilson, whom I knew quite well, was that he knew it was good for Britain to stay in. What he did was then mounted a renegotiation which was relatively minor. It did get some concessions, the most crucial ones, which didn't matter to people in terms of public opinion, was towards trade within the Commonwealth. For example, countries like New Zealand were tremendously dependent on the British market. Most of New Zealand's exports went to Britain. That was also true of some other Commonwealth countries like cocoa in West Africa and so on. So when he did manage to negotiate fresh tariffs and fresh trade elements in order to retain the close link with the Commonwealth, that was actually not just cosmetic, it was serious, but it wasn't a huge renegotiation, it was a partial one. It satisfied people who wanted to keep those trade links. So I don't think one can just describe that as a complete sort of piece of deception. What was true was that he made the most he possibly could of it, of course, and persuaded people that, he had now got something out of the renegotiation. But in the case of the current renegotiation, of course the common market is now much more integrated than it was, or more precisely the community. It has many, many more rules and regulations with regard to trade, and the things you can trade with, things you can't. So I think the renegotiation is much more difficult now. I also think most people believe, and I do too, that it will be on relatively minor matters, and that the key thing will be whether most people want to stay in or whether they want to go out.
And should David Cameron allow a free vote, as did Harold Wilson in 1975?
Probably yes, but whether he will, I don't know. He's got a much more... Harold Wilson's party was essentially held together by giving a great deal of freedom. For example, the freedom of cabinet ministers to campaign on either side. I don't think so far that the Prime Minister, David Cameron, has actually talked about the possibility of a free vote for cabinet ministers. It's not just a free vote for backbenchers, which I think he will concede. It's having a free vote at the cabinet level, which is absolutely critical constitutional change. And so we still don't really know whether that will be what David Cameron will agree to. But undoubtedly some of his ministers, who are very strongly anti-staying in the community, will want to, as we have the opportunity to campaign and to vote as they think right. That will be quite a pressure on the Conservative Party. We're not there yet.
You served under two prime ministers, Harold Wilson and James Callaghan. In your memoirs, you say that James Callaghan, he was an embodiment of Attlee's government in 1945, and you praise his leadership. Why then he wasn't a very successful prime minister in your view?
He was a successful prime minister, actually. He wasn't a very successful foreign secretary. He didn't know a great deal about foreign affairs. He wasn't all that interested.
On the contrary to Douglas Hume, he was a good foreign secretary, but not a good prime minister.
That's what they said about Douglas Hume. Well, Douglas Hume is a special case. He was a throwback, really, to more aristocratic years. But to be fair, I think one would have to say that Jim Callaghan actually was a very good prime minister. And one of the things, with great respect, you need to look up is that if you go look at the Winter of Discontent, 1978-9, you will find that Jim Callaghan, and in the election that followed, runs far ahead of the party. Jim Callaghan, as a person, remained well thought of and popular. What he couldn't do was to carry his party with him. And so the Labour Party, as such, was much less popular than the Prime Minister. And I think that did exemplify what I believe, which was that Jim Callaghan was very good at giving the impression of being the Prime Minister of all the people, not being a partisan Prime Minister, not being hard left or hard right, but rather an inclusive Prime Minister. And I think he was clearly very popular.
And had he called an election in 1978, your party would have won the election, is that right?
I think, no, I don't do it for certain, but it was much better chance. Because that would have been before the extreme behaviour, the refusal to bury the dead, the refusal to take people to hospital and that kind of thing, when the unions really became very extreme. That was in 79, first half of 79. But the chances, I remember I was with Peter Shaw, he and I were the two that said to the Prime Minister, please think again, because if you go through to 79, you'll be very lucky to win. And 78, you're still very popular, you're well thought of, the economy is slowly getting better, you have a real chance of winning then. I think he just felt, I can't stand it, another election now. He was very tired, he had endless battles to fight, and I think he just felt that he didn't really want to go on.
As you may know, I did Denis Hilly's last interview, and then in his last interview, he regarded you as one of his closest friends in Parliament. And I asked him, why didn't he join your party, the SDP? He said, simply because it was too divided as a party. Do you agree with him?
What was too divided, the SDP or the
SDP? The SDP.
No, it wasn't divided at all.
That's why he didn't join you, actually.
I think it was his answer, and I would never question his answer except to say that I think that Denis's roots in the Labour Party were so old, so long-standing, he'd been such a significant figure in it, that for him to change would have been extremely difficult. For Roy Jenkins, it was different because he primarily, his interests became primarily European, moved away from the domestic. He'd been a first-rate Home Secretary, but when he really had to make the final choice, of course, it was to become President of the European Commission rather than to stay in the British Parliament. And I think that was partly a sense that the Labour Party, and the Conservatives for that matter, were at some level little Englanders. They didn't think in international terms, and Roy obviously did. So I think there was a quite substantial difference, that Roy Jenkins's culture was an international culture, and Denis's was very much a national British culture.
But do you agree that if he had joined your party, probably you would have been a more successful party or not? His presence in your party would have...
Oh, I think we'd been more successful. We didn't discourage him in any way. But to be fair, we did actually, you see, until almost the end of the whole crisis, our attitude was that if Denis could win the leadership, or even the deputy leadership, we would stay in and go on fighting. So let's look at it quickly. On the leadership, for some reason I don't quite understand, Denis didn't actually fight as hard as we expected. He didn't fight hard at all. He seemed to think that he would just become the leader because he'd been a successful Chancellor of the Exchequer, and he was thought highly of, and he was very brave and so on. So he didn't really put much into it. When it came to, after he lost to Michael Foot and then fought for the deputy leadership, by that time he himself realised how high the stakes were and how great the risks were. And so he then put much more of himself into battling for the deputy leadership. And even given that, he only, as you know, won by an absolute whisker. A few hundred votes, really.
To Tony Benn.
To Tony Benn. And so, he was determined to stop Tony Benn because, as you probably know, he had very little respect for Tony.
He said it was one of his greatest achievements, actually.
Well, except he could have won the leadership. There's no doubt. If he could win the deputy leadership by fighting the way he did, I think he could have won the leadership, because many people realised that although Michael Foot was much loved and very popular, he wasn't actually a natural political leader. He wasn't a natural leader. He was a natural thinker. He was more like an academic in some ways. So although he was a brilliant speaker and a brilliant debater, I don't think most people thought that he could actually pull the Labour Party back into being a united party, whereas I think people thought that Denis could. And
once on Trident, he said that I would never press the button, but still we talk about Denis Hilly as the best Prime Minister that this country never had. And Jeremy Corbyn, he said the same thing, and we say that he's unfit to be Prime Minister. Why is that?
Well, I don't know. I don't think everybody says that. Some people say that, of course. There's a big difference. Denis was... I think Jeremy Corbyn is a decent man, and I think he's an idealistic man. But the big difference is this. Denis had dealt with crisis after crisis after crisis, including the IMF crisis, which was one of the hardest of all. He'd come out on the whole on top. And the IMF, he got even the IMF to back off and, as you know, reduce the amount of money they said we had to pay by about £1 billion. which succeeded in holding the cabinet together and the party together. I don't think you can say about Jeremy he has anything like those sorts of experiences. He hasn't been dealing with really difficult international problems. Dennis fought in the war, he led the invasion of Anzio and so on. So he was used to dealing with a serious crisis. Jeremy really isn't. He's a good man, and I think he probably has a lot of domestic commitments to all sorts of good things. But he's not been tested in, and he's after all already nearly 70, he's never been tested in the most difficult international issues. And at a time when we've got ISIS, and we've got Syria, and we've got Russia marching around in Ukraine, you really have to have somebody with profound experience.
But why nowadays we don't? But why nowadays we don't have Rab Butlers anymore, Niall Bevins anymore, Ian MacLeods anymore, Lord Helshams anymore, or Michael Foots anymore, or Shirley Williams anymore?
They're most all dead.
Yeah, but why we don't produce their politicians anymore? They belong to a golden area, a golden era. Is that right?
Well, yeah, it's easy to say that, and I think we really don't know. I mean,
they were unique people, weren't they? So.
No, I won't buy that one. I don't quite believe in the unique people theory. What I will buy is that I think the challenges of the Second World War shaped and refined many of these people. Bit early, Kelly.
I know, but someone else is a committee room. So.
They need the room, do they?
Yeah.
Just
5 more minutes.
Just
okay.
fun.
I'm sorry, this will be under constant pressure. So the straightforward answer to that is that I think if people were shaped by the war, either being in it or living as victims of it, they simply got used to the idea of life being harder, of people having to deal with more difficult problems, but also they had the extraordinary confidence that came from having seen the Attlee government immediately after the war doing things like creating the National Health Service, creating things like the increase in the compulsory education age to the age of 16, beginning at 15, then to 16. So there were all sorts of huge reforms that were made at that time by a government which had huge debts to deal with, huge pressures upon it, and so forth. It was a very imaginative government. I think part of that came out of the refinement of fire. So in other words, what happened with them, what happened in terms of their having to cope with the crises that followed the war. And if you compare it against the First World War, the difference is immense. And the peace after the First World War was a disaster. The peace after the Second World War was remarkable. Marshall Plan and all the rest of it.
Yes. And your parents, they wrote a book together, and in it says that above your parents, Vera Brittain, and your father, they wrote a book together, and in it says that above all nations, there is humanity. Yes. So have you always been internationalist?
Yes, always. And as a child of 9, I was evacuated to the United States, and I spent 3 years living with a family I'd never met before, an American family. And then when I came back, I got involved in the in dealing with youth movements in Germany as part of the democratization of what had been Nazi Germany. So yes, from very early on, I was engaged in international things.
And my 2 last questions. First, as Tories, they swiftly shifting to the right, and Labour, they shifting to the left, and Lib Dems, your party, they've been wiped out. So which
haven't been wiped out.
But which party should embrace now the centre ground?
Well, I have to disagree with wiped out, because that would suggest we had no remaining councillors, no remaining MPs and so on. We're quite used to going up and down. It happens all the time to us. And I think we're going up again. I've been talking a lot in Lib Dem parties up and down the country. They're all gearing up for fighting mayoral elections and local government elections, in some cases by-elections for Parliament. So no, they're not wiped out. But they have been pushed back a long way. I quite agree with that. And they've got to fight their way back, and they know it. What was your second question?
And my last question is that you've been, what are the challenges that you think that this government, this new elected government, will face over the next 5 years?
The Conservative Party?
Yes.
They have rolled back quite a lot of things that they actually agreed to.
Mainly under welfare.
Yes, mainly under welfare, but not only under welfare. I give several other examples. Leaving the European Court of Human Rights, that's a Tory policy, not a Lib Dem policy, the opposite of Lib Dem policy. you're right about welfare, but it's not only welfare, it's also, will one sustain the NHS even if it means extra taxes? On all these things, we don't agree with the present government. And during the coalition, they almost always conceded these things to us, including raising the tax threshold to protect people with low incomes. Now that they're entirely a Tory government, and don't forget they've only got a majority of 12, I don't think it will last very long, they are reverting back to traditional Toryism, which means that the relationship between parties will become more charged and more acute. I think in a year and a half's time, the Conservative Party will be very unpopular indeed. And I think we will begin to win a lot of the elections.
And last quick question, do you think that Nick Clegg failed to reform the House of Lords when he was deputy?
I think it was a mistake of him to, yes, he did fail, but I think it was a mistake to make that a central point anyway.
What should be done then, in your view?
In the House of Lords?
Yes.
It's a terribly complicated question. I think I can only say that my own view is that it will become I'm a federal person. I think we should have a federal Britain. I think that within that federal Britain there should be an upper house, and that upper house should be based on the House of Lords, but not hereditary, elected on a regional slate, which means that you'd have a generally federal second chamber.
Shirley Williams, it was a great pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
And just to tell you